what is it that would interest, a particular actor not only to participate one time, given that, it could go violent, and there's repercussions in terms of, prison, there's lots of things that could happen to you. So why, would these particular actors not only, participate one time, but 3 times? And what was their particular role? In the sense of, was it just as a volunteer and, not really, their implication was very small, or was it actually a growth? So this story really is a story about political socialization of 5 young men. And it's told really through the story of the historical event. Within the chapters, I do discuss, the context in terms of Ukraine, how, it, achieved independence and what the political climate was like, and, how these particular movements came to light and what were their roles in these particular movements. So in the first ones, they were primarily as, volunteers, first time, activisms for many of them. And many of them were, teenagers. They were probably, between 12 years old and 15 years old, in these particular movements. So they were quite young and, a lot of risks at take. And what did they learn from this experience that 4 or 5 years later, when they were in universities, the majority found themselves in universities, either in Western Ukraine or in the center in Kiev, what was it that kept them, interested in being, involved? And also not only just being involved as an activist, but actually starting, campaigns. So many of them, took a leadership role and actually got involved in, doing particular activities during a particular time, during the Orange Revolution, were quite active. So here we find, a trajectory, between, 2000 and 2004 of professionalism, between this particular cohort. And then the story for me during my research had ended there. But with this new book, we were able to find out what happens next to the 25, 28-year-old, 10 years later, that is now, in their late 30s, mid-30s, late 30s. So for me, my interest was really to find out, where are they now? What was their activities in sense? Do they stay in civil society? Were they politically engaged, in local, local actions as activists, for housing or ecology, et cetera? Just, these kinds of interests, or, what brought them back? If they were, they went back to a family life, many of them were married and had children. Why come back, 10 years later? And so what we found, at least from this small group, which is not representative of everyone, was that these particular actors actually helped train another generation, under them, kind of similar to what happened to them in 2004. They found themselves in roles in which, they were actually seeing a need for organization, because with the Maidan, as with, in 2004, it was less difference. There was a huge difference in the sense that it wasn't organized. It was basically, a call on Facebook that gathered people together, and it was like, what to do now? And many of them, that I spoke in the book, I interview, and they talk about their particular reflections of this movement. They were really strucken by, how there were so many people here, but yet there was no organization. So many of them took it upon themselves, to found, a movement to kind of, organize it, to structure it in the sense of like, they had medical services, food services. All of this was like, thought out. And many of them were able to contact some of their friends from 2004 that they hadn't seen since 2004 that had the resources and actually the know-how, to get, things organized. So quite rapidly, in this particular case, as we saw in 2004, that many of them, had a structure of support. They had businessmen, they had local businesses, they had a community, to help, them, to kind of sustain this particular movement, which was a lot longer than the Orange Revolution. So it was completely different. And also here, what was different from the Orange Revolution, and in the book I compare, was also the tactics. And for many of them in 2004, they were very much for a nonviolent movement. So that was the strategy that they had selected, and were trying in 2014 also to duplicate. And so here we see kind of like the actors' choices in the sense of like these activists in 2014, when it does turn violent, what are their responses, and for many of them, they had families, they had different kind of things at stake, whereas before they didn't have anyone. They were, universities, they were young men, and, they were more willing to take a risk. But here we see kind of like how the responses, in the sense that some of them withdraw from the movement and others find other outlets in terms of like maybe newspapers and, their positions as professors in universities to speak out in different ways. Others, go anyway, with the support of their families, so here we see like a variance in the sense of like what's at stake for a particular movement. And so I think this particular book is very interesting in the sense that it not only tells the story of a movement from, kind of like a micro perspective in the sense of looking at it in terms of the context and how they overlapped in a historical point of view, which is very important, but also it shows the human response to it in the sense that it's not always as, as black as white as we expect it to be. The choices are difficult, and the conditions in which activists operate are not always as romantic as we think.